army is a cross-section of the community. Absolutely different people take part in combat with different levels of training, culture, and most importantly, totally different motivations. The constant supply of military hardware is critical, but it's not the weapon that wins battles, rather the spirit. The battle ends not with the exhaustion of material, but with the abandonment of the struggle by one side. War demands teamwork. Often, the heroism of some is nothing other than the result of miscalculations or the criminal negligence of others. The efficient and coordinated actions of the whole unit can avoid battles as the frightened enemy simply flees from the battlefield into a safety zone. This is the 18th series of the film about the ATO, History of the War. We're trying to get to the bottom of the anti-terrorist operation in the east of Ukraine, namely its cause and effect. What does the Russian Federation have to do with all this? How does the confrontation between Ukraine and Russia pose a potential threat to Europe in general? On August 21st to 22nd, forces of the Composite Company of the 93rd Brigade attempted to recover the village of Petrivske at the foot of the Savur-Mahila hill. Despite the loss of 2 infantry fighting vehicles, the unit retreated and tried to establish contact, but it failed. On the hill, the group of Colonel Hordichuk continued to fight in the encirclement. A serious problem that the armed forces of Ukraine had to face in the spring and summer of 2014 was the lack of experienced intermediate-level officers. There is a simple explanation for this. The Ukrainian army predominantly had no combat experience. If on a strategic map the grand design and big plan looked quite rational, its implementation was not always effective and timely. Nothing in this world happens without reason. Everything that is done has its own cause and effect. The tenure of ex-President Viktor Yanukovych dealt a serious blow to the power of the armed forces of Ukraine. When in March 2014 the army was put on an alert, mobilization and hasty repair of equipment began at the same time. But those who joined the army were not ready to deal with the problems that they faced. After all, neither the military parades nor the war movies depicted the serious problems with the uniforms, food rations, and spare parts for military hardware. At the same time, volunteer units demonstrated significantly higher and serious motivation, which in some way compensated the lack of skills. However, because they were controlled by the Ministry of Internal Affairs, they did not have heavy combat weapons. Interaction between the forces of the Ministry of Internal Affairs and the armed forces of Ukraine often had to be established on the basis of direct agreements between commanders on the ground. However, any officer that does not take advantage of his privileges does not have the right to force the staff to obey the commands. Indeed, thousands of soldiers that were mobilized to serve in the army were not ready to blindly follow orders from their superiors. As it turns out, there is a lack of experience. It should be understood that the army is in some way an abstraction of the state. The stagnation and disorganization in previous years led to the outflow of qualified personnel. Low salaries were the main reason that skilled and capable people did not enlist in the army. In truth, these people had a passion for what they were doing. In a critical situation, people learn quickly. Many officers that were bravely acting in battle formations took the proper approach to subordinates and explained to them, in layman's terms, the essence of a specific operation in order that they could easily gain some measure of authority among the staff. As soon as this approach proved effective, the units entrusted to them began operating effectively. But not all succeeded. After several months of the summer campaign, those that were mobilized for the army on the wave of patriotism lost their enthusiasm. The level of morale decreased in many units, which was due to Russian propaganda, which in the news was regularly announcing the deaths of soldiers of one brigade after another. The moment when a soldier reads news on the internet, where they read that the whole army is defeated and the main commander is not able to intelligibly refute this fact, they become frightened. Then a soldier loses the will to fight, and this fear infects him or his compatriots. Specifically, on August 22nd, near the settlement of Kuteynikove, the positions of the 5th Territorial Defense Battalion were shelled. The garrison of the checkpoint abandoned the position. The soldiers were demoralized by the withdrawal of their units from the border and reports of enemy tanks in the Savur-Mahila area. August 23rd, the press service of the Armed Forces headquarters of the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic announced the formation of 3 additional infantry brigades and a change in the tactics of military operations. However, this army had long been formed. It stood waiting in the wings at the border. The artillery units of the Russian armed forces, up to 6 divisions, shelled the positions of the Ukrainian army from their territory. After the withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from Izvarine and Dovzhanske, the bombardment was aimed at the second echelon of the Ukrainian defense forces. As a result, unable to withstand the shelling, the entire 5th Battalion abandoned the position and withdrew from the war zone. Despite the order to retreat 40 kilometers from the state border and take up new positions, most soldiers simply refused to continue their service, and the unit abandoned the war zone altogether, leaving for a safer place. Taking into consideration the retreat of the neighbors, the 19th Mykolaiv Regiment of the National Guard defeated the enemy, setting up an ambush near the village of Lysyche, but later it covered the Komsomolsk area, now Kalmiuske. The company task force of the 28th Brigade retreated from Amvrosivka to Kuteynikove, and most of the soldiers eventually withdrew from the war zone. There were only 18 soldiers left in the entire company. A lot of damage was inflicted by Russian propaganda as well as Ukrainian journalists that were seeking to find the latest news. In search of popularity, these journalists did not have the discretion to check information and announce the deaths of soldiers of Ukrainian brigades, applying the same method of Russian propaganda. Some of the officers panicked. In short, the domino effect worked quite well and led to the collapse of the front line. It was not possible to bring together the scattered remnants of the combat units. Not meeting any resistance, 8 battalion tactical groups of the armed forces of the aggressor at that time, a 4,000-strong army of the Russian Federation invaded the territory of Ukraine. The offensive was launched in the direction of the cities and towns of Severodonetsk, Torez, today Chistyakove, and Mariupol. The road to the town of Ilovaisk was opened, and then, after that, the battle continued. The troops of Sector D went out of control and the retreat became chaotic, almost like an avalanche. The 2nd Territorial Defense Battalion abandoned the position, which covered the approaches to the city of Ilovaisk from Donetsk. The remains of the company task force of the 28th Brigade fell back to Starobesheve. The units of the 51st Brigade, who were soldiering the roadblocks to the south of Donetsk, also abandoned positions and retreated to the Berezove area. The information pressure of the Russian media and the hysteria pumped up on the internet was quite destructive. The ultimate goal was to instill fear and apply the principle of divide and conquer, not understanding the general state of affairs on the front line. Without having communication and coordination with the neighbors, some units simply fled without trying to take defense positions. The goal of any propaganda was the formation of public opinion in which the matter applies to war and to avoid any panic. When the issue is about war, for the leadership the main target and objective is morale. A person who does not believe in victory will not fight. Creating panic among Ukrainians and instilling in them doubt about their victory in the struggle and disappointment in their abilities was exactly the strategy of Russian propagandists. On August 24th, Independence Day of Ukraine, a military parade was held in Kiev. The national anthem was proudly sung, and many soldiers and military hardware were deliberately withdrawn from the war zone to participate in the festivities. On the background of total enemy disinformation, the fact that mainly cadets of military schools and troops of the Kiev garrison that took part in the parade is not very credible. In the eyes of misguided citizens, it was a kind of feast in the times of the plague, something similar to the 1941 parade on Red Square in Moscow. Back then, the German divisions were at the gates of the capital of the USSR. But in 2014, the world turned upside down, and the Moscow ruler was the aggressor at this time. Ukraine had to hold the parade primarily to prevent the panic of civilians, to instill their hope in the army and confidence in the future. Nonetheless, Ukrainians will end up in a quagmire, both in diplomatic and military terms. But if Ukrainian citizens become aware of this ugly truth, it will only lead to long lines in grocery stores and disorder on the streets. One must keep in mind that the scenario with the so-called peacekeeping operation was planned by Moscow's strategists in advance. Russian troops were on the border of the Chernihiv Oblast, and in order to overthrow the supposedly bloody junta, to restore so-called order and the puppet government in Kiev, Russia needed only to execute two missions, any suitable occasion and a few hours' drive along the Chernihiv highway. In Donetsk, a parade was also held. Militants escorted Ukrainian prisoners of war along the main Artyom Street. Some soldiers were bandaged. Supporters of the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic were throwing eggs and bottles of water at the prisoners, while others jumped out of the crowd and tried to hit the prisoners. In an attempt to cause associations with the 1944 parade of German prisoners of war in Moscow, watering machines were sent behind the convoy of prisoners, symbolizing an act of purification. As for the war zone, the situation changed every hour. It turned out that the Ukrainian troops which retreated from the border literally exposed a line of defense of the Ilovaisk grouping. The volunteer battalions and the armed forces of Ukraine had control of the city and its surroundings. In this case, we must try to understand the exact terminology. A battalion is a military unit that consists of approximately 430 soldiers. There were 6 volunteer battalions in Ilovaisk, but all of them were not up to the required strength to deal with battle casualties because it was done in a rush. As a result, on paper there were only 6 battalions, though in fact there was only 1 battalion, as the total number of volunteers was 397. In total, around 940 operated in the area of Ilovaisk. Later, units of the 51st, 28th Brigades and the company task force of the 93rd Brigade joined the group. However, both the combat readiness and the morale state of this reinforcement left much to be desired. Despite the confusion, Ukraine continued to resist. All artillery and aviation targeted the Russian troops. In the vicinity of the village of Shevchenko, where 2 Mi-24 helicopters struck the Russian paratroopers. In the area of Hryshchovate and Novosvitlivka, there was a multiple Tochka-U missile attack on the command point and the equipment gathering point of one of the Russian battalion's tactical groups sent in the day before. As a result of the attack, the unit was no longer combat ready and was quickly withdrawn to the territory of the Russian Federation. In the afternoon of August 24th, information was received on the movement of enemy hardware near Ilovaisk. Russians used white bandages as identification marks. Fire attacks were conducted on the identified targets. Near the village of Kuteynikove, tank hunters of the 51st Brigade defeated a unit of the 331st Regiment of the Airborne Troops of Russia. Soon, the scouts of the 51st Brigade took 10 Russian soldiers into captivity. Noteworthy is that all of the prisoners did not hide the fact that they were members of the armed forces of Russia, but they simply said that they had lost their way. The state border was about 20 kilometers away. That said, Russian paratroopers were trained to navigate their way by sun and the stars, or maybe they did not have such capabilities. But in any case, the front line collapsed. The reasons for this were insufficient training of the hastily mobilized Ukrainian army, lack of experience of line officers, and the lack of support of the morale of the personnel. Over 23 years of independence, the armed forces of Ukraine existed separately from society, and the day of reckoning had come. At 12 a.m. on August 24, 2014, Sector D ceased to exist. Remnants of the troops were transferred to the B command staff. the army of the Russian Federation entered the territory of Ukraine. Russian paratroopers from the 300th and 33rd Airborne Regiments, the 8th and 19th Specialized Motorized Rifle Brigades, and the 31st and 56th Specialized Brigades began blocking the ill-advised company of Ukrainian troops.